morning of June 9th, 1944, SS Panzer Grenadier Adolf Morawetz sits inside his Panther tank, turret number 312, watching the French countryside through his periscope. The air inside smells of diesel fuel, gun oil, and the sweat of 5 young men crammed into a steel box. 3 days after the Allied invasion at Normandy, his company received orders to retake the village of Nory-en-Bessin from the Canadian forces who held it. Morawetz feels something close to confidence. His Panther is supposed to be invincible. The mathematics are clear. 80 millimeters of frontal armor, angled at 55 degrees, providing protection equivalent to 139 millimeters of vertical steel. The Americans cannot touch it from the front. Their 75 millimeter guns bounce off like stones thrown at a fortress wall. Even the British 6-pounder anti-tank gun, which had performed well in North Africa, can barely scratch the paint at combat ranges. His, Company 12 Panthers from the 12th SS Panzer Division rolls toward Norry at 1300 hours. They approach in 2 columns, engines roaring, tracks churning the Norman soil into twin furrows of devastation. The plan is simple, the kind that has worked before. Overwhelm the Canadian position with superior firepower and armor. Standard Panzer doctrine. Textbook tactics. At 1,000 meters from the village, the Canadian tanks open fire. The first thing Morawetz notices is the sound. Not the familiar crack of a 75 millimeter Sherman gun, something deeper, sharper, like the tearing of metal at its molecular level. His Panther shudders. For half a second, he thinks they have struck a mine. Then comes the second impact. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The ammunition for the MG-42 machine gun ignites inside the crew compartment. Flames erupt through the confined space where 5 men work in coordinated rhythm. Through his periscope, in the half-second before he desperately claws at the hatch above his head, Morawetz watches the Panther beside his own explosion. The entire turret lifts into the air like a child's toy thrown in anger, spinning as it rises before crashing back to Earth 30 meters away. In the next 4 minutes, 7 of the 12 Panthers are destroyed. The survivors retreat in disorder, leaving Nory-en-Bessin firmly in Canadian hands. Morawetz survives. His tank and most of his crew do not. The bodies were recovered 3 days later, burned beyond recognition. What happened in those 4 minutes would become a pattern that repeated across the Norman countryside throughout the summer of 1944. The Canadians had not been firing regular Sherman guns. They had been firing something the Germans had not expected to encounter in such numbers, the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, mounted in specially modified Sherman tanks that Allied crews called Fireflies. And at 1,000 meters over half a mile, the 17-pounder could penetrate straight through a Panther's frontal armor as if the steel were paper. This is the story of how the most feared German tank of World War II met the weapon that transformed it from an instrument of terror into what Panther crews themselves came to call a suicide machine. It is a story about the collision between technological confidence and material reality, about the mathematics of armor penetration and the psychology of men who discovered their protection was an illusion. To understand how profound this shift was, you must first understand what the Panther represented to the men who crewed it. By June of 1944, Panther crews had earned their confidence through experience and engineering. The Panzer V Panther tank was born from Germany's traumatic encounter with the Soviet 34 in 1941. German tank crews on the Eastern Front had watched with growing horror as their Panzer IIIs and IVs were consistently outmatched by Soviet tanks with sloped armor and powerful guns. The psychological impact cut deep enough that designers received emergency orders to create something superior immediately. The result combined the sloped armor concept of the 34 with German engineering precision and a devastating 75mm KAK 42L70 gun. That gun could penetrate 139mm of armor at 1,000 meters. Its high muzzle velocity and accuracy made it lethal at ranges where Allied tanks could not even respond effectively. The frontal armor proved equally impressive in testing and combat. The 80mm upper glacis plate, sloped at 55 degrees, was effectively impervious to most Allied tank guns when struck from the front. American 75mm shells simply bounced away, leaving only scratches. The British 6-pounder anti-tank gun, which had performed admirably against earlier German tanks in North Africa, could barely damage it at normal combat ranges. Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most respected panzer commanders, published tactical recommendations for Panther battalions that emphasized this technological advantage. Engage at long range 1,500 to 2,000 meters, where the Panther could destroy enemy tanks with near impunity, while remaining invulnerable to return fire. Never present the sides or rear. Spread out platoons to maximize overlapping fields of fire. Maintain reserves 1 kilometer behind the front line to cover the flanks. It was doctrine built entirely on the assumption of technological superiority. And for the first year of the Panther's service life, from its combat debut at Kursk in July 1943 through the spring of 1944, that assumption held true often enough to sustain confidence. When Allied planners prepared for the Normandy invasion in early 1944, they committed a critical intelligence failure. They knew about the Panther. Soviet intelligence had provided technical details after capturing examples on the Eastern Front. The tank had been encountered in small numbers by Allied forces in Italy, but American and British intelligence analysts made a catastrophic assumption. They believed the Panther would remain a rare heavy tank, produced in limited quantities like the Tiger, deployed only in elite formations for specific missions. They were wrong by an order of magnitude. By the 6th of June, 1944, Germany had produced thousands of Panthers. Production had reached approximately 380 units per month by May of that year. In the Normandy sector, 38% of all German tanks were Panthers. For American units, equipped with standard 75mm Sherman tanks, this represented a tactical disaster of the first order. The standard M4 Sherman, armed with the 75mm gun, could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any practical combat range. Crews had to close to within a few hundred meters and aim for specific weak points: the thinner side armor, the rear engine deck, the gun mantlet if the angle was perfect. That meant closing to ranges where the Panther's 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman with a single hit through the frontal armor. American tank crews developed mathematics of survival that were simple and brutal. It took 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Panther. 4 of those Shermans would burn. Their crews would die. The 5th might succeed if it could maneuver to the Panther's flank while the German crew was distracted by killing the first 4. These were not theoretical calculations. They were observations drawn from actual combat in the weeks following D-Day. Crews learned them by watching friends burn to death in tanks that were supposed to protect them. By late June of 1944, after experiencing the reality of Panther engagements across multiple sectors, General Dwight Eisenhower was furious enough to demand immediate action. He ordered comprehensive penetration tests of all Allied guns against captured Panther hulls. The testing occurred at multiple locations using actual battlefield conditions and ammunition. The results confirmed what tank crews already understood from direct experience. American guns were catastrophically inadequate against the Panther's frontal armor. The 75mm gun could not penetrate frontally at any range. The new 76mm gun, which had been rushed into service specifically to address German armor improvements, was better, but only marginally so. It could penetrate the Panther's mantlet at 500 yards if the angle was favorable, but it could not defeat the glacis plate, even at point-blank range. The Americans had one weapon system that could handle Panthers effectively: the M36 tank destroyer, armed with a 90mm gun. But the M36 did not arrive in Europe in meaningful numbers until September of 1944. For the critical months of June, July, and August, the entire Battle of Normandy, American armoured forces were consistently outgunned when facing Panthers. But the British had pursued a different path. While American planners had remained sceptical about the scale of the Panther threat, the British were paying very close attention. After spending 2 years catching up to German tank development in North Africa, watching their tank designs consistently prove inferior in combat, they were determined not to fall behind again. The experience of being outmatched had been psychologically devastating and tactically costly. Development of the 17-pounder anti-tank gun had begun in late 1940, before the Panther even existed as more than preliminary sketches. British designers correctly anticipated that German armour would continue to thicken, that each new tank design would be harder to defeat than the last. They needed a gun that could handle whatever came next, not just what existed now. The 17-pounder, actually a 76.2mm gun that fired a projectile weighing 17 pounds, emerged from this forward-thinking design philosophy. When the first prototype 17-pounders were rushed to North Africa in early 1943 to counter the Tiger I heavy tank, they were so urgently needed that they arrived before proper carriages had been manufactured. These emergency weapons were mounted on 25-pounder gun howitzer carriages, creating improvised hybrid weapons that Allied troops nicknamed pheasants. They worked. The 17-pounder could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor from 1,000 yards using standard ammunition. This was a revelation to crews who had been struggling with inadequate 6-pounder guns. But the British faced a structural problem that threatened to waste this technological advantage. They did not have a tank capable of mounting the 17-pounder. British tank designs, like the Cromwell and Challenger, were either not ready for production or physically incapable of accommodating such a large gun. The Challenger tank, specifically designed around the 17-pounder, experienced constant delays and mechanical problems. The Cromwell's turret ring was too small. The solution came from an unexpected source: two persistent British officers who proposed mounting the 17-pounder in the American-supplied Sherman tank. On paper, the idea appeared impossible. The 17-pounder was enormous. Its breech alone was massive, requiring significant space behind the gun. The barrel extended over 13 feet. The Sherman's turret had been designed for the much smaller 75mm gun. Nothing about the Sherman's internal geometry suggested it could accommodate a weapon 50% more powerful. Initial proposals were rejected by the Ministry of Supply. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. But through a combination of bureaucratic persistence and connections with influential officers who understood the tactical necessity, the project received official approval in late 1943. Engineer W.G.K. Kilbourne solved the seemingly impossible technical challenges through a series of clever compromises. The gun was mounted on its side rather than upright, changing the recoil geometry. The turret was modified with new internal bracing. The co-driver's position was completely eliminated, and that space was converted to ammunition storage for the massive 17-pounder shells. The radio operator took over the bow machine gun. The crew was reduced from 5 to 4 men. The result was awkward, cramped, and mechanically brilliant. The Sherman Firefly, as it came to be called, mounted one of the most powerful anti-tank guns in the world on a reliable, mass-produced chassis that Allied supply chains already supported completely. By the 6th of June, 1944, 342 Sherman Fireflies were ready for deployment with British and Canadian forces landing in Normandy. Production accelerated rapidly. By the end of August, over 550 Fireflies had been delivered. British and Canadian armoured regiments were equipped with 1 Firefly per troop of 4 tanks. The ratio was low, only 25%, but it proved sufficient. Because the 17-pounder could accomplish something no other Allied tank gun could, it could kill a Panther from the front at normal combat ranges. The British War Office conducted systematic penetration testing against captured Panthers throughout 1944. The data was compiled into classified intelligence reports and distributed to tank crews and unit commanders. The numbers told a story that would fundamentally alter the tactical calculus of armoured warfare in northwest Europe. Using standard armour-piercing, ballistic capped ammunition, the kind available in quantity, the kind crews could rely on receiving regularly. The 17-pounder could penetrate 130mm of armour at 500 metres and 119mm at 1,000 metres, when striking at a 30-degree angle from vertical. Against a Panther's 100mm gun mantlet, even when that mantlet was struck at an angle, the 17-pounder achieved reliable penetration from ranges exceeding 2,500 yards. Against the Panther's side armour, penetration was essentially guaranteed at any combat range. The sides were much thinner than the front, protected by only 40mm to 50mm of vertical steel. The 17-pounder could penetrate this thickness from well over 2,000 yards, but the 17-pounder possessed a special type of ammunition that pushed penetration performance into a different category entirely. Armour-piercing discarding sabot rounds used a dense tungsten core, much smaller than the gun's caliber, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum sabot that fell away after leaving the barrel. The small, heavy penetrator achieved extraordinary velocity, and therefore extraordinary penetration. APDS ammunition could penetrate 209mm of armour at 500 metres and 192mm at 1,000 metres, when striking at a 30-degree angle. This meant the 17-pounder firing APDS could theoretically penetrate even the front of a King Tiger heavy tank at combat ranges. Against a Panther, it was absolutely devastating. British intelligence analysis confirmed that APDS could penetrate a Panther's frontal glacis armour from 1,500 metres. There was a significant problem with APDS that limited its tactical usefulness. The ammunition was horrifically inaccurate compared to standard rounds. The sabot's separation from the penetrator after leaving the muzzle caused unpredictable flight characteristics. At a test range under absolutely ideal conditions with experienced gunners, APDS achieved only a 20% hit rate at 800 yards. In field trials against a captured Panther, experienced gunners firing dozens of rounds at ranges between 200 and 600 yards achieved roughly 50% accuracy. Beyond 1,000 yards, the accuracy degraded so severely that test firers at British ranges frequently could not hit a stationary Panther-sized target at all, even after multiple attempts. So Firefly crews used APCBC as their standard combat ammunition. It was accurate enough to hit targets reliably at 1,500 to 2,000 metres. And it was powerful enough to penetrate Panthers frontally at 1,000 to 2,000 metres, exactly the ranges where German doctrine said Panthers should be invulnerable. APDS was kept in reserve for close-range emergencies, for situations where absolute penetration was needed immediately, and accuracy mattered less because the target was close enough to hit reliably. The psychological impact of this capability on Panther crews cannot be overstated. For the first time since the Panther entered service, there existed an Allied weapon that could kill them at the ranges German tactical doctrine considered safe. The fundamental assumption underlying Panther tactics that frontal armor provided protection at long range was no longer true. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 8 days after the engagement at Nory-en-Bessin, another confrontation demonstrated the tactical lethality of properly employed fireflies. Sergeant Harris of the 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards commanded a Sherman Firefly near the hamlet of Comparitedy, Lingevres, close to Tilly-sur-Seulles. His gunner was Trooper MacKillop, a Scottish soldier known both for exceptional marksmanship and for a personal philosophy about ammunition that his crewmates found amusing. MacKillop hated wasting shells. 5 Panthers from an unidentified German unit approached along a narrow road, moving at moderate speed. The crews appeared confident, unaware that a Firefly lay in concealment roughly 1,000 meters distant. Sergeant Harris waited, calculating range, wind, and the optimal moment. The Panthers continued their approach. Turrets traversed forward, maintaining formation. At approximately 1,000 meters, MacKillop fired the first round. The lead Panther exploded, flames erupting from hatches as ammunition cooked off. The second Panther was struck before its crew could react to the first tank's destruction. The third Panther attempted to reverse, but the driver's panic made the maneuver clumsy, and MacKillop's third round penetrated the frontal armor while the tank was stationary. The fourth Panther turned to present its side, a catastrophic tactical error born of confusion, and was destroyed by the fourth round. The fifth Panther managed to begin a retreat, but MacKillop's final shot caught it before it reached concealing terrain. 5 Panthers destroyed, 5 rounds fired, 5 hits. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes from first shot to the destruction of the final target. Harris and MacKillop repositioned their Firefly twice during the action, using terrain features to maintain concealment and prevent German artillery observers from fixing their location. This was textbook Firefly doctrine. Exploit the gun's range advantage, strike from concealment, move immediately after firing to prevent counterfire, strike again from a new position. German after-action reports from units operating in that sector during mid-June noted devastating long-range British anti-tank fire, but struggled to understand what weapon system was being employed. Some reports incorrectly attributed kills to towed anti-tank guns rather than tanks, because German doctrine held that no Allied tank gun could achieve such performance at those ranges. This confusion was not accidental. British command had issued explicit orders that Firefly crews must camouflage their tanks to disguise the distinctive long barrel. Crews wrapped the barrel end with foliage, painted counter-shading patterns to break up the gun's outline, and avoided exposing their silhouette unnecessarily. The Germans had learned quickly to prioritize Fireflies once identified, directing concentrated fire from tanks and anti-tank guns toward any Sherman with a long barrel. But camouflage could not hide the fundamental tactical reality. Any time a Firefly could see a Panther, the Firefly could kill the Panther. And Panthers could no longer rely on armor for protection at long range. On July 8, 1944, during Operation Charnwood, a major British offensive to capture the city of Caen, the village of Buron, became the site of one of the most successful anti-tank engagements of the entire Normandy campaign. The battle demonstrated both the lethality of the 17-pounder and the tactical problems German armoured units now faced. A mixed force of Panzer IVs and Panthers from the 12th SS Panzer Regiment launched a counterattack against Canadian infantry positions south of Buron. The German plan followed standard counterattack doctrine: use armoured mass to disrupt enemy offensive operations, drive the infantry back, restore the defensive line. The tanks advanced with infantry support, moving across relatively open ground toward prepared Canadian positions. They encountered B Troop of the 245th Battery, 62nd Anti-Tank Regiment, Royal Artillery. The unit had been attached to the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry to provide anti-tank support. Their equipment consisted of both towed 17-pounder, anti-tank guns and M10 Achilles self-propelled guns, modified American M10 tank destroyers that had been rearmed with 17-pounders instead of their original 3-inch guns. The engagement was brief and catastrophic for the German armoured force. 13 German tanks were destroyed, a mix of Panthers and Panzer IVs. British losses included 4 self-propelled guns destroyed and 4 more damaged, but the German counterattack was completely shattered. The German infantry, without armoured support, could not continue the attack and withdrew. British gun crew accounts describe firing in rapid succession at ranges between 800 and 1500 metres. The terrain south of Buron provided excellent fields of fire across relatively flat, open ground. German tanks attempting to close with the Canadian infantry positions found themselves completely exposed to devastating anti-tank fire from prepared positions that the advancing tanks could not effectively suppress. For Panther crews, this type of engagement represented the collapse of their tactical doctrine. The open terrain that should have favored their superior long-range firepower instead exposed them to equally long-range Allied guns that could penetrate their armor. The numerical advantage they expected more Panthers than Fireflies in most engagements did not matter when every 17-pounder position could destroy any tank it could see. The armored doctrine that had sustained German tactical confidence was becoming a death sentence. Not all terrain favored the Fireflies' advantages. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the dense bocage, created tactical conditions that negated many of the 17-pounders' strengths and created new vulnerabilities for both Panthers and Fireflies alike. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer Lehr Division, filed reports noting that the Panther performed poorly in bocage terrain. The long gun barrel severely reduced maneuverability on narrow lanes between high hedgerows. The tank's weight distribution, front-heavy with the engine in the rear, made it difficult to traverse steep embankments. The crew's vision was restricted by the high hedges, making them nearly blind to infantry approaching from the sides. The Firefly suffered nearly identical problems. Its barrel was actually longer than the Panther's over 13 feet, compared to roughly 11 feet for the Panther's main gun. In confined spaces between hedgerows, both tanks struggled to maneuver without exposing vulnerable side armor. And the Firefly's powerful long-range gun became almost useless when engagement ranges measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds. Close-quarters combat in villages and dense bocage favored neither tank design. Both were vulnerable to infantry anti-tank weapons, British Piites, German Panzerfausts, American bazookas. Both could be destroyed by well-positioned anti-tank guns firing from ambush at near point-blank range. In these conditions, crew training, tactical awareness, and simple luck mattered more than technical specifications. The engagement at Chaux on June 27th demonstrated these dynamics clearly. 6 Panther tanks from an SS unit moved through orchards and sunken lanes approaching British positions held by the 5th Duke of Cornwall's light infantry. The terrain prevented long-range engagements. Visibility was measured in dozens of meters, not hundreds. British infantry attacked the Panthers with Pi-80 anti-tank launchers at extraordinarily close range. Sergeant Hicks disabled the 1st Panther with multiple Piat hits, beginning his attack from 100 yards and closing to 10 to 15 yards for the final disabling shot. Captain Blackwell stalked a 2nd Panther unseen by the German crew and fired his Piat from only 10 yards away, disabling the tank before the crew could react. The infantry attacks confused the German crews and, critically, bought time for British anti-tank gunners, who were attempting to bring a 6-pounder gun into position roughly a quarter mile to the rear. When the gun crew, Sergeant Wilson, Corporal Bryce, and Private Elliott finally had their weapon positioned and ready to fire, 3 Panthers had pushed into an orchard approximately 400 yards away. The gun engaged all 3 Panthers in rapid succession, destroying them with 11 rounds total. Lieutenant Colonel Atherton was killed during this action while assisting the crew as a loader, replacing a casualty. Private Elliott later described the engagement as a terrific scrap, noting that the Panthers were difficult targets because they were approaching head-on and were partially concealed by trees. 4 of the 6 Panthers were destroyed in the engagement. The remaining 2 were damaged and withdrew. The action demonstrated that in close terrain, neither Panther armor nor Firefly firepower guaranteed victory. Crew courage, tactical flexibility, and the ability to coordinate between infantry and anti-tank assets determined outcomes. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.